You get a text message from your pastor asking, "Are you willing to preach next month?" Filled with excitement you reply, "Yes, I would love to preach next month." Then reality sinks in. What did I just agree to do? How do I write a sermon? This question causes people to feel overwhelmed every week. But I want to give you some preaching tips on how to write a sermon without being overwhelmed. First preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to schedule time to work on the sermon. Don't try to do it all at once. Break it up into small pieces and do a little bit each day. Plan to be done 2 days before you preach so that you can spend time reading and practicing it so you know it really well, and feel super confident when you preach your sermon. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to only have one main idea. Too many ideas introduced in a sermon will cause listeners not to be engaged. When you are preparing your sermon, keep the main idea at the center of everything you say. That way people will stay interested and not get confused. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to divide your sermon into smaller sections. Some people like a sermon outline with 3 sections: introduction, body, and conclusion. I use a sermon outline that have 4 sections: introduction, exploration, application, and invitation. There's no special number of sections that you have to use, but it's important to find a way to organize your sermon that feels good to you, so it flows nicely and people can follow along easily. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to use several resources for research. There are many Bible study tools to help dive into the truths of God. Some offline resources would include Bible translations, concordance, commentaries, and study guides. Some online resources would include Bible.com, BibleRef.com, and BibleHub.com. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to create a process to writing your sermon. An effective way to create a sermon writing process is to design a template that you will follow each time you preach. This process can begin by reading your sermon passage in at least 3 different Bible translations, such as New International Version, Christian Standard Bible, and English Standard Version. As you read, pay attention to who's in the story, what's happening, why it was written, and what it means for you. Write these details down to reference later in your sermon preparation. After you have your own thoughts, look for more information in the Bible study tools mentioned in the last preaching tip, to make your sermon even more engaging. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to organize your main idea and an outline. A good practice for preparing a sermon, especially for people new to preaching, is write an outline first. Start by listing the most important things you want to say in your introduction. Then list the most important things you want to say in your body, including explaining your main sermon verse. And finally, list the most important things you want to say in your conclusion. As you are preparing your sermon, use interesting stories and examples to make sure the sermon is easily understood. People will want to listen and stay connected to what you're saying. The next preaching tip to write a sermon without being overwhelmed is to create a manuscript of what you want to say in your sermon. A manuscript will help with sermon preparation and delivery. After you have written your sermon outline, begin with the body of your sermon first, writing down every word you want to say. After you finish with the sermon body, then go to the sermon introduction, and finally to the sermon conclusion. When you have a manuscript, it will help you practice and remember your sermon better. Because when you preach your sermon, you won't have to keep looking at your manuscript. You'll know the main ideas and what comes next. For more preaching tips, watch these videos where I go in more detail on how to write and deliver an engaging sermon.